Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Colley. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Federal Agency Strategies for Reducing Elder Fraud. We've given folks, I think, a few minutes now to get in, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to make sure that we can hear everyone, please make sure that your line is muted so that we can ensure everyone can hear. And then during the webinar, at any point, if you have a question and you'd like to make sure that we get to it during our Q&A portion, which will be at the end of the webinar. We're going to save the last 15, 20 minutes or so, the end of the webinar for questions. Please make sure that you jot them down in the Q&A sort of function that you see at the bottom of your screen. You just click on the Q&A function, then a little pop-up will come onto your screen. You can enter your question that way, and if we can answer it during the webinar, we will. If not, we'll make sure to leave that question to be answered live when we get to Q&A. Next slide, Chloe. So just a reminder, our code of conduct for our meetings that we typically have in person also applies to our digital virtual meetings. You can learn more at ncrc.org/code. Again, the questions and in the questions function pod at the bottom, so please feel free to submit your questions that way. And then check us out at ncrc.org. You can also learn more about us Twitter at NCRC, and our tags, Treasure CRA and Just Economy. Next slide, Chloe. And for those of you who aren't aware of NCRC, briefly, we're the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. We've been going strong since 1990. We're a grassroots membership-based coalition. Our primary goal is to create opportunities for people to build wealth. We have a gamut of folks across the country who we call our members, who come from community reinvestment organizations, community development corporations, local and state government agencies, faith-based institutions, community organizing, civil rights, local and social service providers, a whole host of folks that we're proud to call our NCRC members. As part of membership, we offer a number of programs and services from agenda setting research, training. We renovate and build affordable homes for low to moderate income families. We build business expertise for entrepreneurs, train and support housing counselors, test and challenge discrimination in financial services and housing, and a whole host of other programs and services. And please feel free to check out our site at ncrc.org to learn more. Next, Chloe. Oh, whoops, I think we missed the sort of the middle parts of the slide. Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we go and turn it over to or Darius.
Okay.
Nan or Darius, are you on the line?
Hi, it's Darius Kingsley. I was just able to join. Apologies for the delay.
Do you have any sort of introductory comments about the webinar and the presentation that we're going to have today? No, maybe not. Well, I'll go ahead and say that we're really excited to have this presentation today. I think that folks are probably aware that NCRC has been involved in the age-friendly banking space for many years now, probably since, I think, 2011, 2012. And age-friendly banking is very important to us. And one of the sort of principles of age-friendly banking is ensuring that older adults have the ability to function, to do their banking and have their own economic security without being preyed upon by fraudsters, scammers. Financial exploitation and financial elder abuse is unfortunately an increasing issue in the United States and across the world, and finding ways that we can either partner with regulators, partner with financial institutions, various partnerships that we see across sort of the spectrum of folks and stakeholders that are involved in minimizing elder financial abuse is really important to us. And one of those initiatives that we're highlighting today comes from the partnership between DOJ and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And we're excited to have both Jacqueline Blasey-Fried from the Department of Justice and Brendan Donahue from the U.S. Postal Inspection Service here with us today to tell us a little bit more about their special program and strategy that they have, that they work together to make that happen. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. As I said, we're joined today by Brendan Donahue. He is a program manager with the Mail Fraud Criminal Investigations Group with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Brendan works in the national headquarters where he served as the acting team leader for the Inspection Services Department of Justice International Fraud Team, which is embedded with the DOJ Consumer Protection Branch. And he oversaw the Inspection Services participation in the newly formed DOJ Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force. Prior to his career with the Inspection Service, Brendan served as a police officer in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts and Watertown, Massachusetts. Brendan is a graduate of Holy Cross College in Worcester. And then we're also joined by Jackie Blasey-Fried, who is a trial attorney with the Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Branch. In her time with the department, Jackie has handled a variety of civil and criminal consumer protection matters, including matters involving unsafe food and drugs, abusive telemarketing practices, odometer tampering, and scams targeting the elderly. Jackie assists the department's outreach and coordination efforts for its Elder Justice Initiative and the Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force. Jackie is a Kansas native, and prior to joining the department, Jackie clerked for the Kansas Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Her interest in consumer protection predates her interest in the law and arose when she was a housing and credit counselor for a nonprofit organization. And we are very happy to have both Brendan and Jackie here today to tell us a little bit about their work that they do. I think I'll kick it to you, Jackie and Brendan.
Thanks so much, Karen, and to the whole NCRC crew and to JP Morgan Chase as well for this opportunity to talk to you all. We really appreciate this opportunity to touch to such a broad swath of community advocacy organizations as well as industry and our fellow folks in government agencies. As Karen said, my name is Jackie Blasey-Fried. I'm a trial attorney with the Consumer Protection Branch, and I have been with Consumer Protection Branch for just about 5 years. Sorry, while I'm doing this, I'm trying to share my screen and I am not able to. Hold on just a second. There we go. So Brendan, I'll kick it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Karen. Thank you, everybody from NCRC for having us today. My name is Brendan Donahue. I am a program manager with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service out of our national headquarters, and I have leadership of our mail fraud program, which has a broad range of investigative activities that we conduct. Jackie?
And what Brendan and I are going to talk to you all about today is give you really just a high-level overview of what DOJ and USPIS are doing in the elder fraud space. Frankly, combating elder fraud, both prevention, mitigation, and prosecution efforts consume probably the vast majority of my and Brendan's waking hours. This is an initiative that's very close to both of our hearts, and there's a lot of work being done. But what we can do today is just give you a general sense of what we're doing. Before we do that, however, just briefly what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about the scope and nature of elder fraud, talk about some of the dominant schemes that we are seeing, and some of those that appear to be taking the most money from U.S. consumers. So as you're working with consumers and in the communities, you know what types of scammers might be targeting the individuals in your community. And then we'll talk about agency enforcement strategies and then public awareness and outreach. First of all, just briefly to give you a sense of who I am. As Karen said, I come from the Consumer Protection Branch, which is part of the Department of Justice that's based in Washington, D.C. One thing that is unique about the Consumer Protection Branch as far as D.C. portions of DOJ go is we have both civil and criminal authority. And as you'll hear about a little bit later in the presentation, we are big proponents not only of prosecuting schemes criminally where we can, but also where we can shutting down schemes using civil tools. That way we have fewer individuals who ultimately end up losing money to fraudsters. We have an embedded team of law enforcement agents. As Brendan said, a team of inspectors sits just below the office that I normally sit in, and USPIS staff and their inspectors do a lot of our significant elder fraud casework. We also have a coordinating role in some initiatives that you'll hear about a little bit later in the presentation, including the Elder Justice Initiative, the Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force, and Money Mule Initiative. And we'll talk about all of those at least a little bit as we go through today's presentation. Brandon?
Yep, and so just by way of background for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, in case you're not familiar, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the United States. It's responsible for preserving the safety, security, and integrity of the nation's mail system from criminal misuse, and that is often carried out through criminal investigations, enforcement of the nearly 200 federal laws that pertain to the U.S. Mail and the U.S. Postal Service. Nationwide, there are nearly 1,200 postal inspectors who are sworn federal law enforcement officers, and of those, approximately 300 conduct mail fraud-related investigations. The agency in our mail fraud program has a specific focus on mass marketing fraud investigations that target vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, and that is really a specific focus for the inspection service. And as Jackie mentioned, we have a team of postal inspectors, analysts, and victim service specialists who are embedded at the DOJ Consumer Protection Branch as part of the DOJ Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force as part of our commitment to protecting the vulnerable and the elderly. So to highlight some recent cases and efforts, and these are joint efforts between DOJ, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and in some cases other agencies and U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country. And the first one, which references a British man sentenced to 70 months for a fraud scheme that victimized hundreds of thousands of U.S. consumers. This involves a case in the United States versus Gareth Long, who was convicted of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft in regards to using remotely created checks as part of a mass marketing fraud scheme in which he stole funds from consumers using remotely created checks. The second one, district court orders injunctions against 2 telecom carriers who facilitated hundreds of millions of robocalls for civil injunctions brought by the DOJ Consumer Protection Branch against companies, including one company by the name of Toll Free Deals and another one by the name of Global Telecom. And those cases involved literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, of robocalls that were placed onto the U.S. network directed at American consumers, including the elderly, with millions of calls placed every single day. And those injunctions helped cease that conduct. And those telecom carriers acted as gateway carriers. So they were the first stop within the United States for transnational criminal organizations to place fraudulent robocalls onto the U.S. network. The third case, again, another joint investigation with DOJ, involves 2 Peruvians who pled guilty to overseeing call centers that threatened and defrauded Spanish-speaking U.S. consumers. Those 2 Peruvians were Johnny Machado and Rodolfo Hermosa from Peru, who helped facilitate a extortion scheme from Peru, much of which was directed at those Spanish-speaking U.S. consumers, individuals who just by virtue of their status in the United States, their language abilities, made them more vulnerable than other U.S. consumers. And then fourth and finally, this involves a list broker who was recently indicted for facilitating elder fraud schemes, a gentleman by the name of Norman Newman, who has been indicted out of Connecticut for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, as part of a psychic scam. Again, these scams directed primarily at elders in the United States. And these cases help highlight the efforts of DOJ and the Postal Inspection Service to combat transnational criminal organizations and other individuals who would perpetrate fraud schemes against America's elders.
Next, I want to give you just a brief scope and nature of the elder fraud problem, and then sort of focus today's conversation on the kinds of fraud schemes that Brendan and I tackle at DOJ and USPIS. Initially, and this is some data that comes from the Federal Trade Commission, who have a really great data book that they pull out every year from data that they draw from their consumer complaint database. One thing that's interesting, and I think is often not talked about frequently, is when consumers report fraud to the government, we actually find that younger people report losing money to fraud more often than those who are often considered elderly. But when those who are considered elderly, in this case to the 70+ range, do report losing money to fraud schemes, they tend to lose more money than their younger counterparts. Just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of schemes that people end up losing money to, I think these are a couple that are in the news recently, in part because of how pervasive they are. One that we are finding is just growing exponentially in particular is romance scams. Romance scam losses from, I believe it was 2018 to 2019, essentially doubled over the course of really just a year. And we're seeing more and more people who are falling prey to these online dating scams where they think they have really developed a true relationship with someone, and then that individual starts asking them for money, and then often, as we might talk about later, will start using them essentially as a money mule to move money for other parts of the scheme. These are not only really costly scams to individuals, but also when Brendan and I and when our teams deal with victims, we're not only dealing with sometimes unbelievably devastating financial losses, but genuine heartbreak. And so this is a scam that we're watching very closely and that many U.S. attorneys' offices, as well as DOJ and USPIS, are working to counter. Another one that most everyone knows about, because likely you have gotten the phone calls, are imposter scams. These are where someone, usually via a robocall, which Brendan talked a little bit about one of our cases against robocalls a few minutes ago, call individuals and pretend to be the government. The agency that they used to impersonate most frequently is the IRS, but now we're finding that more and more fraudsters are impersonating the Social Security Administration. But it's by no means just limited to those two organizations. We see these imposter scams target everyone from local utilities to local police departments to, as you may have seen in the news, there's some concern about contract tracing. So this is, again, a scam where we see really huge losses, and often it's because people are genuinely terrified that the IRS or the Social Security Administration has told them that they're about to lose a substantial sum of money. Just a quick note to sort of target where we're going to be speaking today. One thing about both slides that we just covered, specifically romance scam and imposter scams, is these are what we call stranger-based scams. These are scams where it's not a caretaker, it's not a family member, it's not a trusted contact who is exploiting the elderly individual, but whether someone who is coming from outside that circle of trust, usually via the means of some sort of mass marketing device. According to an analysis done by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that looks specifically at financial filings related to suspicious money movement, it's about half and half stranger versus non-stranger. So it's about half and half, sort of the trusted caregiver form of exploitation versus the stranger form of exploitation. The family member, the caregiver exploitation cases, those are incredibly important cases. And various U.S. attorneys' offices across the country do those cases. Lots of state and local law enforcement do those cases. But the caveat that I want to give you today is that's not my expertise. So when we're going to be talking about elder fraud and financial exploitation today, what I am an expert in is the stranger side of financial exploitation. So I want to note that those other kinds of fraud cases do happen. DOJ is doing a lot in that space, but it's not what we're going to talk about today, purely because it's not where my experience lies. Brendan?
So next we're going to talk about some prevalent elder fraud schemes that we frequently see and investigate, both the Postal Inspection Service and also the Department of Justice, and also our law enforcement partners in other agencies, including the FBI, Homeland Security, Secret Service, and a number of inspector generals. As Jackie mentioned before, romance fraud. It is one of the most prevalent scams that we see nowadays, and it targets people of all ages. But we frequently see older individuals who fall victim to this and also who lose substantial sums of money. Often romance scams begin online. They can begin on such platforms as Facebook or dating sites, or even on what would seem like innocuous apps, such as like Words with Friends, that allows people to communicate with others, and then scammers will initiate a conversation on that platform and then try to move the victim to a different platform. And again, usually professing some sort of love to them, and then usually the scammer, they will portray that they've befallen some sort of emergency, or some sort of emergency has befallen them, and they need the assistance of the victim to pay funds to help them out. Another one, government imposter fraud. So as Jackie mentioned, most of us have received those IRS phone calls or Social Security Administration phone calls threatening us with arrest or suspension, many often perpetrated from overseas. But many of these make use of individuals such as money mules here in the United States to help move victim funds. We've also seen government imposter scams as well, with individuals who portray themselves as the Postal Service or law enforcement in order to defraud victims. Lottery sweepstakes fraud. This is another scam that we frequently see, especially with the Postal Service. Individuals who may receive solicitations in the mail informing them that they've won some sort of lottery or sweepstakes, and they need to pay taxes or fees to receive those winnings. We also see victims frequently contacted via phone in lottery sweepstakes frauds scams as well, by individuals who also portray themselves as a representative of government or a lottery or sweepstakes, and again, try to defraud victims by informing them that they need to pay taxes or fees. Tech support fraud. This is often involves an imposter fraud as well, but of a prominent company. Individuals may portray themselves as representatives of Microsoft. They'll contact the victim, inform the victim that there's a problem with their computer. In order to resolve it, the victim needs to let the scammer into the computer and remote in order to fix the problem. And oftentimes the victim will allow the scammer into their computer, and then the scammer then takes control of their computer, either one, to make it appear as if there is a problem with the computer, or two, to take the computer in short hostage in order to demand payment from the victim for their services. And then last but not least, family emergency fraud. Sometimes we call these grandparent scams or relative in distress scams. And this is where a victim will be contacted, often via phone, by somebody who is portraying themselves as a family member or law enforcement or a legal representative who represents that a family member is in distress and they need some sort of assistance. They may have been in a car accident. They may have been arrested by the Mexican police while found carrying drugs in Mexico. There are many different variations of this scheme, and then the scammers will demand payment in order to help resolve the issues. So challenges for law enforcement, investigating those schemes and other schemes. First is the international origins. Fraud schemes, especially transnational elder fraud schemes, they know no borders, and they don't respect borders the way law enforcement and governments do. And as a result, because law enforcement and the Department of Justice, because we work within a system where there are rules and regulations and laws, and we have to respect international borders and international law, it makes it more challenging for us to investigate. Different countries also have very separate privacy rules than from the United States that are often more stringent and allow for greater protections of citizens within those countries. There are also different rules and laws relative to extradition from other countries. So even if we do identify a scammer in another country, it can often be difficult or challenging to extradite them to the United States to answer justice in the US courtroom. That is not to say that we don't pursue those cases. We certainly do. And we have a lot of experience at working with international law enforcement and international justice bodies in order to seek justice for US victims and victims throughout the world when the United States is used in part to facilitate a elder fraud scheme. Also, layered money movement. It is very easy to move money from financial accounts to financial accounts from many different banks and financial institutions throughout the United States. There are also other new payment mechanisms constantly evolving, whether that's electronic payment mechanisms such as Venmo or Zelle. There's also cryptocurrency, and then traditional banking. And then there's also the money movement through the mail or other common carriers such as FedEx and UPS. All that to say, bad guys take advantage of that and they'll layer their money movement. So they will use multiple payment mechanisms in order to disguise and throw off law enforcement and private industry as to the movement of their funds and to get it out of the United States. And as soon as the financial institutions or the Postal Service or government and law enforcement puts regulations in place, scammers are out there trying to find a new way to move that money to make it more difficult for law enforcement, regulators, and private industry to detect that movement. Third, there's a large and vulnerable victim population. There is a significant population in the United States of older Americans. It's growing every day. And as a result, there's a large pool of people for whom scammers can take advantage. Not to mention, many of those individuals have worked their whole lives. They have a significant amount of savings, and they are ripe for the picking, unfortunately, for scammers. And then finally, we see frequent re-victimization. So what we see is victims often are victimized time and time again by scammers, and victims often have their names added to lead lists or sucker sheets and other names for that, and their marketing lists for scammers, and they pass them and sell them to each other, and as a result, victims are frequently re-victimized, and a victim who is victimized once, they're more likely to be victimized again and again and again because scammers flag and identify that victim as somebody who is a good victim. They're a paying victim. So what are some of the solutions? First, increase cooperation among law enforcement agencies. As opposed to working within a silo, law enforcement, including state, local, and federal law enforcement, often work together, sometimes as part of task forces, sometimes just jointly on investigations. The DOJ Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force is a perfect example of this cooperation among law enforcement, brings multiple law enforcement agencies together, including the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, Social Security Administration, Office of the Inspector General, U.S. Secret Service, among many other agencies to work cooperatively on investigations to break down those borders. And those borders are not just limited to within the United States that we're breaking down, but we're working more and more cooperatively with international law enforcement, whether it is in North America, in Europe, or in Asia. We work frequently with our partners in those countries to share intelligence and also to work on investigations in order to bring those to justice. And what we have found is that often those transnational criminal organizations that are perpetrating fraud against American victims are not just limiting that fraud to American victims, but they're targeting individuals in other countries as well. And so it is important to work with our law enforcement partners. Second aspect of this is we focus on all aspects of the scheme. We don't just focus on the scammers, but we focus on the infrastructure that makes these scams possible. So we look at, for example, the infrastructure involved in robocalling. I gave the example before of toll-free deals and global telecom. Those are gateway providers who help pass phone calls onto the U.S. telephone network. And so in part, we look at parts of the infrastructure like gateway carriers or complicit financial institutions that turn a blind eye to activity occurring within their networks. And we will investigate those individuals or institutions and seek to find redress in order to help bring scammers and those who help perpetrate the scams to justice. Finally, there's a renewed emphasis on disruption and prevention. We know that we are not going to arrest our way out of this problem. It is simply not possible. And so two aspects that we are focusing more so now is disruption and prevention. So on the disruption side, taking actions that we can to disrupt schemes as early as possible to stop the bleeding, you know, as an analogy in terms of the financial ruin that scams can wreak on victims, and then also prevention and working with private industry, financial institutions, community groups, and also with other government agencies on prevention and bringing awareness to these scams and also bringing awareness to reporting. Jackie?
Now we're going to talk just briefly about some of the agency enforcement strategies, and in particular talk about a couple of the large initiatives that DOJ and USPIS are involved in and show you some of the results we've gotten over the last couple of years. And what is behind the results really is an increased emphasis on focusing on elder fraud schemes. And within these various law enforcement agencies, as well as prosecution offices and civil offices, is really developing an expertise in figuring out how best to tackle these schemes, what are the pressure points that we can push in order to cut off the victimization, and then how do we bring all of that work to bear to let the general public and frankly let the fraudster community know that we are watching these schemes and we are dedicating more and more resources, time, attention, and expertise to tackling these schemes, whether they're perpetrated from outside the U.S. or inside the U.S. So the first is that for the last several years, we have had a large number of elder fraud sweeps. These typically happen around Consumer Protection Week, which is in March each year. And we use that opportunity of Consumer Protection Week to really focus, hopefully, the press attention and the public attention on what DOJ and its law investigative partners are doing in the elder fraud space. For instance, one year we had a particular focus on tech support, and we had a number of civil as well as criminal cases that focused on perpetrators both here in the U.S. and I believe abroad, who were focusing and perpetrating tech support operations. So these sweeps, like I said, tend to come out March of every year. So be on the lookout for this because it gives you a sense of what kind of cases DOJ and its law enforcement partners are doing. And you'll notice not only, we stop massive losses, and we also have a number of victims that we are saving money, but we often have a pretty staggering number of defendants who were charged and the losses that go along with that. Associated with those sweeps typically are some sort of consumer education campaign. That's both from DOJ and from a variety of our law enforcement partners. And this is a great opportunity to see the breadth of the cases that DOJ and others are doing in the elder fraud space to get a sense of the kind of scams that are out there and the kind of schemes that we're tackling. Additionally, as Brendan mentioned, in June of 2019, the Attorney General, Bill Barr, initiated the Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force. These are districts in the United States, as well as the Consumer Protection Branch, who are specifically tasked with tackling these very complicated transnational criminal organizations who are using whatever networks there are in the United States in order to victimize American consumers. So these could be call centers in India, they could be people emailing or calling from Jamaica, and these districts in the United States and the Consumer Protection Branch are specifically tasked with doing everything possible and dedicating resources, time, and attention to taking down these transnational schemes that are incredibly complicated, but also have an incredible amount of loss to American consumers. And I'll turn it over to Brendan for a discussion of money mules.
Thanks, Jackie. So now I'm going to talk about money mules. So first, just as a quick primer, what are money mules? Money mules are individuals who are engaged in the movement of money for scammers. Some may be witting, so they may actually know what is going on. They could be family members, they could be associates. And then there are those who are unwitting. And often what we find in those who are unwitting, they are often victims who are turned into money mules by scammers and convinced that they need to help move money on behalf of the scammers for one reason or another. So what are our challenge with money mules? One, proving knowledge can be very challenging. So did the money mule know what they were doing was wrong and that it was illegal and that it was in support of a scam? Two, prosecuting labor and resource intensive. It is extremely time-consuming process to prosecute an individual money mule, especially trying to prove the knowledge of that money mule. And as I said before, we're not going to wrest our way out of this in terms of fraud schemes, and money mules are part of that critical infrastructure to moving fraud victim funds. And there are just so many money mules that it is extremely challenging to dedicate the time and resources necessary to prosecute every single money mule out there. And I guess that leads into the third one that I just mentioned in part, which is the number of money mules dwarf available resources. There are just so many money mules out there that there is not enough time in the day or resources for all of the federal law enforcement agencies combined to effectively investigate and prosecute all of those money mules. So what's our solution? We use all the resources available to us. And we've also taken a different approach to enforcement and what is an enforcement action. If I say to you today, postal inspectors, the FBI, Homeland Security, we're going to take an enforcement action, most of you would picture that as law enforcement arresting somebody, maybe executing a search warrant at somebody's house, but it's often much softer than that. And there is no need in many circumstances in order to conduct that level of enforcement in order to have an effective outcome. So what do? Knock and talks. This is often where a postal inspector or another law enforcement officer will conduct a knock and talk. So they will visit that money mule's place of business, their house, their residence, and talk to them about their conduct, interview them, gather intelligence as to the conduct of the scammers. And they'll also warn those money mules about their activity, inform them that what they are doing is wrong and potentially criminal, and that they could be furthering a scam. And we've found that those knock and talks are often very effective without going any further. We do, though, try to combine those knock and talks with warning letters. And so warning letters and what we frequently refer to as money mule letters or unlicensed money transmitter letters, it is a letter that we provide to a money mule where it informs them that we believe that they may be facilitating a scam, that their conduct may be illegal, and that we believe that they're moving money. And so we put them on notice. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest challenges that law enforcement often has and prosecutors is proving the knowledge of criminals. And in money mules, that's especially difficult. But we're, in short, providing knowledge to those money mules that their conduct may be illegal. And then the next level of enforcement is a civil injunction. Often these are 1345 civil injunctions where we seek relief from the court and to prevent the conduct of the money mule. The civil injunction provides a wide array of remedies for a judge to take against a money mule. And again, we're not at the level where we're prosecuting somebody. We don't need the same level of proof to bring a civil injunction, but it is often very effective. And if somebody violates it, they are in contempt of court and may be subject to prosecution for that contempt. And then fourth and finally, criminal prosecution of money mules. We often reserve this for those most egregious circumstances or when we've exhausted the previous levels of enforcement actions. Finally, we're proactively identifying and interdicting money mules. We're working with financial institutions, we're working with private industry, and we're working within our own networks and our own intelligence that law enforcement has to identify and interdict money mules and to try to change that behavior, whether it's through soft enforcement or more hard enforcement. So I'm going to speak briefly in regards to money mule interdictions that the inspection service has done. And these are concentrated money mule interdiction efforts that we engage in with our law enforcement partners, including DOJ. And we have committed to conducting these money mule interdiction efforts in those DOJ transnational elder fraud strike force districts. These tend to be major metropolitan areas. They tend to be areas where there are populations of individuals from regions of this world that frequently perpetrate some of these scams and who use family members who live in these districts to perpetrate these scams. Our goal is both disruption in terms of actually interdicting victim parcels that contain proceeds, We also have those enforcement actions that I previously mentioned. And then interdiction, where we're seeking to interdict parcels, return the funds to victims, or in cases where we're unable to identify the victim, have those funds forfeited to the government so that they may be returned in the future. These interdictions also help us with case development, again, identifying intelligence from knock and talks, interviews, and taking that intelligence and learning more about the scammers and what they're doing and leveraging that into investigations. Finally, the last component of this is victim services, and the inspection service has victim service personnel who work with elders and conduct almost a phone concierge victim service program where they will reach out to individuals who are identified as victims. They'll speak to them. They'll make sure that they're receiving the services that they may need. They'll contact and report to local elder affairs or elder adult protective services in order to make sure that there is an intervention of some sort with the victim and to make sure that the victim is provided with a level of service that will help prevent future victimization. Jackie?
So in addition to the USPIS's interdiction to specific districts, last year we also had a Money Mule initiative that there were, I believe, 6 or 8 law enforcement agencies that were involved. There were also some state attorney generals who were involved in this initiative. And basically what it was in October and November of last year, we asked agents across the country to really fan out and try to attack this Money Mule problem and to do some of the things that Brendan was talking about. To simply knock on their door, and maybe it's someone who fell prey to a romance scam and at some point was then asked to start ferrying money from other romance fraud victims. And maybe that person maybe they had a little bit of idea that something wasn't quite right. And then when you get a knock on the door from a federal law enforcement officer, hopefully something clicks. And that is all you need to then stop that Money Mule activity. So in 2019, these law enforcement agencies took action against 600 Money Mules. That's knocking on a lot of doors. We had Money Mules in over 85 federal districts. We served 500 warning letters, and then there were a number of individuals who were charged with criminal conduct, and there were also civil and administrative actions as well as search warrants. So again, this is one way that DOJ and its law enforcement partners are really trying to think innovatively into how to tackle these transnational schemes and go after parts of the schemes that we can tackle here in the United States. And all of the schemes that we talked about earlier, tech support, romance, sweepstakes, almost all of those in most schemes have a Money Mule component. So this is a way, as Brendan said, we can stop the bleeding and we can hopefully limit victim losses while we pursue the perpetrators who are overseas. Really briefly, we do want to talk about both the importance of public outreach and awareness efforts as far as what DOJ and its law enforcement partners are doing on the prevention side. As Brendan said, we are not going to arrest our way out of this problem. And in addition to targeting those who are perpetrators or facilitators, one method that we certainly do want to use as frequently as we can to limit victim losses is reach the community. It is absolutely essential that we work on the prevention angle. Because of the number of victims and potential victims who are out there, we have to find a way that we can educate those victims, educate community members, educate people that those potential victims talk to about the potential fraud schemes that are out there. And there's some good research that has shown that for people who get, for instance, a government imposter phone call, or maybe gets a message from a romance scammer, knowing about the scheme makes a real difference. And knowing how the scheme is perpetrated makes a real difference. And so Brendan and I take almost every opportunity we can get, opportunities like this one, to talk to advocates in the community and to talk to industry about what types of schemes are out there and how they're targeting victims in the United States. The other thing that we know, and this is from a Better Business study, an FTC study that was done a couple of years ago, we also know that sometimes when someone has fallen prey to a scam, having an outside individual ask the right question can make all the difference. This could be maybe someone who's going into a bank branch and is trying to send a very large wire to a foreign location. And the teller just asked for a grandparent scan, for instance. Have you called your grandson? Or something along those lines to maybe clue the victim into the fact that what they're doing is likely the product of a scam. We know that someone asking the right question makes a difference. We know that community support makes a difference. That when people don't feel isolated, or when we don't allow victims to become isolated by fraudsters, we see a lower rate of victimization. And Brent would like to talk about USPIS's prevention efforts.
So as Jack and I both mentioned multiple times, we're unable to arrest our way out of this problem, and so prevention is critical. And so the Postal Inspection Service, we engage in traditional prevention methods, including the delivery of prevention material to the public in print, and then also occasionally through public service announcements, some which you may see on television. We've also engaged in social media prevention efforts. More so than ever, and leveraging those social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram and sponsored messaging that allows us to really target our messaging at certain populations that research has shown may be more susceptible to victimization. We also engage in interagency partnerships, including with the Social Security Administration Office of Inspector General. In the next week or two at the nearly 35,000 post offices throughout the United States. There will be posters going up in those post offices providing prevention education relative to Social Security Administration imposter scams. Also, our victim services personnel, they are in a large part of our strategy to providing prevention messaging to those individuals who are known victims. We also engage in partnerships with the financial sector, local law enforcement, and the private sector in general, such as the tech industry, to work on prevention and spreading our prevention messaging in order to make the public more aware. Finally, we also think it's important to engage in research and to participate in research relative to victimization. The National Institute of Justice recently funded a research project on victim intervention strategies, and we're engaging in that research project with a nonprofit research institution by the name of RTI and a researcher at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Marty DeLima. And one final thing that I wanted to note on money mules is that in our enforcement strategies there, is we're looking very closely at the impact and the effect of our enforcement strategies, and in part to assess whether or not if what we're doing is the right strategy. As mentioned, we're not going to wrest our way out of it, but we want to make sure that whatever we are doing is a cost-effective approach and that is effective. And so what we do is we look at recidivist behavior. So individuals who engage in the same activity after we have come into contact with them, whether that's through a money mule warning letter or a knock and talk. And what we've found through those interdictions we've done, that there is a recidivism rate of about 10 to 15%. So that means of those individuals that we've come into contact with, only 10 to 15% continue to engage in the same conduct, or at least we only have visibility into that conduct. So they may change their behavior, but we'd like to think that a majority have stopped that behavior and are no longer acting as money mules. Jackie?
So just briefly from the DOJ side, as far as what we're doing on outreach and coordination efforts, one of the really critical pieces of what DOJ is doing in the prevention space is we have made sure that in every U.S. attorney's office across the country, there is a single U.S. attorney, and sometimes more than one, who is specifically tasked as the Elder Justice Coordinator. That Elder Justice Coordinator is responsible for ensuring that cases get brought and interdictions are made, but also in working with local law enforcement, working with agency organizations, and doing outreach in the community to talk to folks about the kinds of scams and the kinds of schemes that the Department of Justice is seeing being perpetrated against U.S. consumers. So regardless of where you are in the country or U.S. territories, there is someone in your local U.S. Attorney's Office who is the Elder Justice Coordinator, and one of their hats that they wear is to do outreach and prevention work. Additionally, on the national side, there's a couple of resources that I want to just mention just briefly. DOJ has a national elder fraud hotline that folks can call and both report fraud to, whether it's a family member or the victims themselves. And then the people who staff that hotline are tasked not only with taking that complaint, but also with trying to walk the victim through other things that they might need. For instance, identity theft protection or something along those lines. So this is more than just a complaint hotline. So a good phone number to jot down and make sure that you know and that you have your community awareness hat on. On DOJ's website for elder justice, elderjustice.gov, there is also a neighborhood map where you can go to your specific state and it will give you this very nice and colorful map and give you a sense of what resources are available in your community. So it might be food, it might be shelter, it might be other sorts of programs that people might need. So this is a good way for someone to tell what sort of resources are in their community for someone who maybe needs some additional support, or certainly someone who is perhaps victimized by an elder fraud scheme. And with that, I think that wraps up Brendan's and I's remarks. We want to once again thank NCRC and JP Morgan Chase for coordinating, and we'll turn it back over to you all.
Thank you, Jackie, so much. You know, this has been such a great presentation and such excellent information that we unfortunately don't have too much time left for questions, but I do want to acknowledge that we have about 15 questions in the Q&A pod. I'm going to ask maybe 2 of them, and then ask Brendan and Jackie if you can also maybe tackle a couple in the chat as well. And if not, what we can do, because I know folks have asked questions, we want to make sure that we respond to them. What we can do is ask Brendan and Jackie if they can respond to some of those questions via email. And then next week when we have the recording available, we'll make sure to send those responses out as the recording. So just going to get to a couple right now. So one of the questions I want to tackle is from Nancy. Do you have any documented red flags or characteristics for financial institutions to identify money mules, both witting and unwitting?
So
Brendan, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So we do have prevention messaging relative to that, but there are red flags that FinCEN provides to the financial institutions, and they would be the best source for those red flags. At this time, the inspection service does not have a specific document for financial institutions on red flags to identify money mules.
Great, thank you, Brendan. Last question before we have some closing remarks from Darius Kingsley from JP Chase. This question comes from Mandy. Do you have recommendations for strategies, specific educational programs that community-based organizations can use when partnering with law enforcement to educate seniors on fraud and scam?
I'm sorry, Karen, you cut out a little bit there for me. So if that was a question for me, I missed it. I apologize.
Sorry, the question was, do you have any recommendations for strategies, specific educational programs that community-based organizations can use when partnering with law enforcement to educate seniors on fraud and scams?
Yeah, so one thing that if you haven't before and you have no relationship with your U.S. Attorney's Office, that certainly might be a place to start. Additionally, there are a number of federal agencies that have some really good publications and things that you can order for free that you can distribute at your various community organizations. If you've never made use of the Federal Trade Commission's brochure bank that they have where you can bulk order materials, you should. They have some really great, very consumer-friendly information on, I think, every fraud scheme that we talked about today. And the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, also has similar resources. They have placemats, they have bookmarks on these various kinds of fraud schemes that you can use to keep that message in front of the victims and in front of the communities that you work with.
And then I'll just add for the Postal Inspection Service, for those community organizations that are looking to have a presentation done, whether it's to a community group or to another organization within the community, postal inspectors are always available to provide those presentations. And I encourage you to reach out to your local U.S. Postal Inspection Service office to arrange that. And the easiest way to get in contact with us is to go to www.uspis.gov, uspis.gov, and you can locate the nearest office or contact us by phone and get in touch with your local office that way.
Excellent. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Jackie, both so much. We really appreciate your presentation today. Feel free to go ahead and add in any other questions, and we will make sure that we get to them at some point. I'd like to now turn it over to Darius Kingsley from JPMorgan Chase to close us out. Darius?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me this time, and I apologize for the technical glitches. We're having a storm move through the Northeast. I'm Darius Kingsley. I'm the head of business practices at Chase, and one of the main things I work on is working to protect the financial health of older adults and vulnerable persons. So first, I just want to thank the NCRC and Karen Kelly for hosting this, for working with our industry. And I especially want to thank the speakers today who we had on. Many of you know, we've been collaborating and discussing a lot of these topics together, and we can't stress enough how grateful we are for their interest. Really appreciate the comment that law enforcement can't arrest our way out of this crisis. Similarly, banks alone can't stop this either. So it's more critical than ever that we work together, partner with people and local and law enforcement, as well as I hope down the road policymakers. You know, and I think from our own perspective as a bank, you know, we know that we alone can't do it. We need all of the other banks and financial services providers out there, because customers who are in the process of being scammed will often shop different banks. They'll get rejected from one bank, and they'll, you know, try to make a large withdrawal, and they'll walk down the street to another. And sometimes they even do it to ourselves, to one Chase branch to another. The social engineering is getting worse. We see fraud rates continue to increase. So it's yet another big reason that we need to collaborate on this. We know that our elder customers have more assets than our younger ones, obviously. But unfortunately, besides being more susceptible to being scammed, they also tend not to report it as much. They tend to be more embarrassed by losses. And so sometimes we're not even sure we collectively, the industry, have our arms around the true scale of the scams. We know already, it's been reported by Bloomberg, that over 5 million older Americans are being exploited every year. So what I would urge financial services providers to do is, you know, make sure you train and empower your customer-facing staff, whether that's sort of bankers or call centers. We are doing more of that. We're realizing we simply we can't do enough. We urge folks to, you know, continue to refine account alerts, predictive analytics, trying to get that information real time to the customers, and hopefully even their families. We urge and we appreciate the collaboration with partners like law enforcement and nonprofit and community organizations like the NCRC, and, you know, just continue to double down, I would say, on financial health and financial education, because I think one of the problems is that the notion of being scammed is something that everyone thinks won't happen to them. And so I think it's important, as we stress financial education, we have to stress this could happen to you at any age. So again, I want to thank the NCRC and our federal government speakers today for this important webinar, and apologies again for the earlier glitch this morning.
Thank you, Darius. And again, thank you to Brendan and Jackie for this presentation today. It was excellent. We really appreciate your participation. And thank you to our attendees. It's been great having you here with us today. Please be sure to check out our upcoming events at ncrc.org/events. And hopefully we'll see you again at our next webinar or event. Thanks a lot and have a great day.